Rose had been eating the same lunch since before the Second World War. Bean soup, some bread, an apple if she had one. She was 104 when we enrolled her in our study, and when one of my research coordinators asked what she ate for lunch, she answered as if the question barely warranted one. The same thing, she said, every day. She did not understand what we were looking for. I had been running the New England Centenarians study at Boston University Medical School since 1995. By that point, we had over 400 people in the cohort, an extraordinary sample for this population. And I was sitting with their dietary records going back decades trying to find the pattern. The methodology matters here because it changes what you do with the finding. We were careful in this study not to ask people to remember what they ate last week. Memory is unreliable at any age, let alone at 102. What we used instead were three approaches: dietary records kept by the centenarians themselves, dietary patterns confirmed by family members who had shared meals with them for decades and were available cross-reference data from population-level studies that had tracked these individuals across time. It is not a perfect methodology. No methodology for this population is, but it is more rigorous than a survey and more grounded than an interview. I expected it to be complicated. I expected regional variation. I expected the Massachusetts centenarians to eat differently from the Adventist centenarians in California, who would eat differently from the Greeks I had data on through our collaboration with the AKA project. I expected to be sorting through noise for a very long time. What I found instead surprised me less than it probably should have, because Rose's lunch kept showing up. Not her exact lunch, the logic of it. The same four food categories in the records of people who had outlived almost everyone born in the same decade they were. One of our participants, I want to stay with him before I get to the data because the data is easier to receive once you have a person behind it, was a man named Giorgio. He was 103 when we enrolled him. He had grown up in northern Vermont, the son of Italian immigrants who carried their food habits from the Marche region of central Italy. He did not think of himself as eating healthily. He thought of himself as eating normally, what his family had always eaten. Every morning, a small handful of walnuts before his coffee. Every afternoon, a bowl of something with beans. Lentil soup in winter, bean salad in summer, chickpeas with whatever greens were in the garden, and bread. Always the dense, dark bread his wife had learned from her Italian immigrant mother. Fermented overnight with a sourdough starter she had kept alive for 30 years. Giorgio's arterial stiffness measurements taken at 103 were in the range we would normally associate with a man in his early 70s. His vascular age by that specific measure was 30 years behind his chronological age. When we showed him the data, he was not impressed. He said he had never had trouble climbing stairs and saw no reason why he should start. He said this while eating the walnuts he had brought to our clinic in a small paper bag from home. He did not know what nitric oxide was. He did not need to. Earlier this week, we walked through Loma Linda with an oncologist who had been tracking a single daily habit in Adventist patients past 55. The same kind of pattern recognition I want to talk about here. Only my data set was 4 foods instead of 1 habit, and the population was 400 times bigger. The mechanism that oncologists kept pointing at in cancer prevention. The quiet, unremarkable consistency of a food that a patient had returned to every day for decades is exactly the logic the centenarian dietary data keeps confirming from a different angle. When I looked at the cross-tabulation of the NICS centenarian records against the documented food patterns of Blue Zone populations, Okinawa, Sardinia, Ikaria, Nicoya, and Loma Linda, I had to double-check my numbers. 2 completely different study designs on completely different populations, conducted by different research teams in different decades. They converged on the same 4 food categories: beans and legumes, whole grains, leafy greens, nuts. That is the list. I know it sounds like the back panel of a grocery bag. It sounds like every general nutrition recommendation you have heard since you were 35. And that is, I think, exactly why it is so easy to dismiss. These are not novel superfoods from a village no one outside longevity researchers has heard of. There are foods you can buy this week at any supermarket in any mid-sized American city. What the centenarian data tells us, though, is not that these foods are good for you in some abstract sense. It tells us that people who made these foods a daily habit, not a sometimes habit, not a clean eating week habit, showed me differences in biological aging markers compared to people of the same age and income level who did not. Let me walk you through each one. Beans and legumes first. In the NES data, centenarians who had maintained regular legume consumption multiple times per week for decades showed lower circulating levels of insulin-like growth, factor 1, IGF-1. Think of it this way. In childhood and young adulthood, IGF-1 acts like a construction foreman. It tells cells to grow, divide, multiply. That is exactly what you need when you are building a body. The problem is that in a fully grown adult, and especially past 65, you no longer want that foreman shouting at cells to multiply as aggressively. When IGF-1 remains chronically elevated after midlife, it is associated with accelerated cellular aging and higher rates of certain cancers. Legumes suppress that signal. The centenarians were not consciously suppressing their IGF-1. They were eating the food that had been available and affordable in their communities for generations. This exact pattern appeared in the Blue Zone data independently. The Adventist Health Study 2, which followed over 96,000 participants, found that Adventists who consumed beans 4 or more times per week had statistically significant reduced risk of colon cancer compared to those who ate beans less than once per week. The Nicoyan centenarians built their daily diet around black beans and corn tortillas. Icarian centenarians ate lentil soup as a household constant. Sardinian centenarians reported fava beans and chickpeas in nearly every weekly dietary recall. Same category, different specific foods, same biological signal suppressed. Now move with me to the second food category, whole grains. Here I want to be precise because the modern food environment has done something unfortunate to this category. Walk into any supermarket and you will find hundreds of products bearing the words whole grain on the label. Many of them share very little biological activity with what centenarians were actually eating. The centenarians ate intact, minimally processed grains, steel-cut oats, not instant oats. Traditional sourdough fermented 18 to 24 hours, not sliced sandwich bread with whole wheat on the label. The distinction matters because processing changes the glycemic response. Intact whole grains release glucose slowly. Heavily processed versions often behave metabolically, more like refined carbohydrates. Check your kitchen right now. If you have any grain product, look at the ingredient list. If the first ingredient is flour, even whole wheat flour, what you are holding is processed. The intact whole grain version would list the grain itself. Oats, barley, brown rice, farro. In the centenarian dietary records, the pattern was intact grain, not flour-based products ground from grain. The Sardinian sourdough is worth a specific mention. Pain carousel, the thin traditional flatbread of Sardinia, is made from durum, wheat or barley that has gone through extended fermentation. The fermentation process breaks down phytic acid, which normally binds to minerals and blocks their absorption. The centenarians in Sardinia were not eating this bread because they had read a paper about phytic acid. They were eating it because that was what their grandmothers made. The biology approved. The price difference between steel-cut oats and instant oats is about 60 cents per week. The difference in glycemic response accumulated across a decade is not 60. That is the arithmetic the centenarians were running without knowing it. The third food category is leafy greens. And here the data is possibly the most striking of the four because the quantities involved are so far outside what most Americans consume that the comparison is almost absurd. Dark leafy greens are among the most concentrated dietary sources of folate and B6 that exist. These B vitamins act as a clearing system for homocysteine, an amino acid byproduct of protein metabolism that when it accumulates at elevated levels is associated with vascular damage, cognitive decline, and increased stroke risk. Beyond homocysteine clearance, leafy greens contain polyphenols that activate a cellular pathway called NRF2. Think of NRF2 as the internal quality control inspector for your cells. When it is activated, it turns on a set of antioxidant enzymes the cell uses to repair oxidative damage. In Icaria, the practice of eating wild greens, horta, boiled or sautéed wild plants gathered from hillsides, was universal among centenarians. The Icaria study, which followed over 1,000 Icarian residents from 2008 through 2013, found that daily horta consumption was one of the strongest dietary correlates of cognitive preservation in adults over 75. Bitter, difficult to prepare, calorie poor, polyphenol dense. The common thread was not the specific vegetable. It was the bitterness, the very quality that makes these plants unappealing to American palates. The bitterness is the signal that polyphenol content is high. The plants evolved bitterness as a defense. We ate them anyway. Our cells developed machinery to use the very compounds the plant produced to resist being eaten. The plants lost that particular arms race, and we are better for it. The fourth food, nuts. The Adventist Health Study 2 included a specific analysis of nut consumption and mortality in a cohort of over 32,000 Adventists, followed for approximately 12 years. Adventists who consumed nuts 5 or more times per week had a 31% lower rate of ischemic heart disease death compared to those who consumed nuts less than once per week. 31%. That is a number that belongs in a clinical trial for a pharmaceutical intervention. It was produced by walnuts, almonds, cashews, and pistachios, eaten as a routine snack. The mechanism runs through several channels simultaneously. The unsaturated fat composition suppresses LDL oxidation. The magnesium content supports vascular function. The arginine content. Arginine is an amino acid, acts as a precursor to nitric oxide, which dilates blood vessels. Think of nitric oxide as the plumber who arrives and unstiffens the pipes. Nut consumption, particularly walnut consumption, appears to support nitric oxide production in a way that helps maintain arterial flexibility. Walnuts also have one of the highest alpha-linolenic acid contents of any common nut, the plant-based precursor to omega-3 fatty acids, which may be part of why they appear so consistently in the dietary recalls of centenarians with good cardiovascular markers. Giorgio's arterial stiffness at 103, 30 years behind his chronological age, was running on decades of that chemistry, one small paper bag of walnuts at a time. Here is the thread that runs through all four categories: beans, whole grains, leafy greens, nuts. None of them are expensive. None of them require a specialty grocery store. None of them involve supplements, precise timing, or caloric calculations. What they require is frequency, daily presence, the habit of returning to them without thinking about it. The centenarians were not dramatic. They were relentless. A daily bowl of bean soup is over 50 years of daily repetition, an extraordinary intervention. It just does not look like one from the outside. The compounding logic is worth pausing on. IGF-1 suppression from daily legume consumption does not produce a measurable outcome in a week. Over a decade, the cumulative effect on cellular aging markers becomes visible. Over 2 decades, the protective effect on certain cancer risks becomes statistically significant. Over 4 decades, you are looking at someone who has quietly accumulated a biological advantage that shows up in their arterial stiffness measurements at 103. The benefit is real. The benefit is just slow, slower than most people are willing to wait for in a culture that measures health interventions in weeks. What is striking when you look at this same 4 foods pattern in the Okinawan cohort is that the centenarians who carried it forward most consistently also turned out to share something just as quiet: the way they slept. There is a cardiologist in Naha who has been studying lateral sleep position and its effect on glymphatic clearance in Okinawan centenarians, and what the stroke admission data shows in that population is worth its own conversation. We will get there. There is one finding I want to add here that I think has been underappreciated in the popular discussion of this research. When we compared centenarians in the NICS who had grown up in food-scarce environments to those who had grown up in more affluent households, the differences in longevity outcomes were not where you would expect. You might predict that the centenarians with access to a wide variety of foods would outlive those who ate narrow, constrained diets out of necessity. That was not what we found. The centenarians who had grown up in more constrained food environments, eating beans because that was what was available, eating whole grains because refined flour was a luxury, eating bitter greens because that was what grew in the garden, showed outcomes that were not worse than their more affluent counterparts. In some markers, they showed better outcomes. This is not an argument for food scarcity. It is an argument for food simplicity. Now, let me be direct about what this research does not prove. We cannot establish causation from observational data alone. The NEC is a longitudinal cohort study. The blue zone analyses are population-level dietary surveys. Neither design allows us to say that eating these four foods will extend your lifespan by a specific number of years. What we can say is that across multiple independent data sets, people who ate these foods consistently and lived past 100 coexisted with those four food categories at a rate that warrants taking the findings seriously. The practical moment. The moment the paper becomes a grocery list, you are adding beans. 1 cup of cooked beans 3 to 5 times per week at minimum. Not as a side thought, as the center of a meal at least twice a week. Lentils are the easiest starting point. They require no soaking and only 20 to 30 minutes of cooking time. You are shifting your grains toward intact. Steel-cut oats instead of instant. Farro or barley as the base of a soup. If you buy bread, the ingredient list should begin with the grain itself, not flour. Traditional sourdough fermented 18+ hours is as close as most Americans can get to the Sardinian grain tradition. You are adding a daily portion of dark leafy greens, a small bowl of sautéed kale or collards or mustard greens in olive oil. The bitterness is the feature, not the problem to be engineered away. And a small daily handful of nuts, an ounce, about 20 almonds or 14 walnut halves, raw or dry roasted, eaten whole. The compounding logic is the hardest part to sit with, not because it is complicated, because it is slow, and because it looks from the outside exactly like nothing. Rose died at 107. Her research coordinator kept in touch with her family. In the last years when she could no longer cook for herself, her daughter made the soup. Same recipe, same bowl. The bean soup was not a protocol. It was not a longevity intervention. It was just lunch. The same lunch every day for longer than most of us have been alive. And that unremarkable constancy is exactly what the data says the biology requires. Not drama, not precision, just the daily return to the same right thing. If this story changes the way you look at the simple staples in your kitchen, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history and science of longevity that they have tried to bury. Start planting the seeds for your future today. Our next deep dive into the secrets of the long-lived will be opening soon.